You actually showed up. Without a lawyer. My brother said it the way you'd point out someone forgot their pants. A few people near the front of the probate courtroom laughed, soft and polite, the laugh you give when you already know who's going to lose. Across the aisle, his attorney clicked his pen twice and set it down. Settled in, comfortable. Then the judge opened the second folder. Not the will, the thicker one. He turned a page, stopped, turned back, and read the same line again. The pen clicking stopped. A paralegal in the second row leaned forward like the floor had shifted under her chair. My brother kept smiling, because he hadn't learned yet to watch the room instead of his own reflection. 26 years I spent reading other people's money for the United States Army. Following dollars that didn't want to be followed. I knew, sitting at that empty table alone, exactly what was in that folder, and exactly which page had just made the judge go still. You're probably waiting for the part where I stand up and put them in their place. There isn't one. I'd stopped needing that somewhere over the second deployment. What I needed was for the truth to finally have to sit in a room and be looked at. But to understand the look on that judge's face, you have to go back 40 years. To a kitchen table in Marion, Ohio, where I learned which child mattered and which one was furniture. My name is Margaret Doyle, Maggie, to the 3 people left alive who like me. I was 54 years old the autumn this happened, retired 18 months, a major out of the Army Finance Corps with a knee that tells me when a front is coming in better than any phone app ever has. 26 years I wore the uniform. Most of those years I spent in rooms that smelled like burnt coffee and toner, doing the unglamorous thing the movies never show you. Making the money makes sense. Auditing, reconciling, finding the place where a number had been told to lie and patiently asking it to stop. Nobody writes songs about that. Nobody salutes a spreadsheet. But I'll tell you something the recruiting posters leave out. A battalion can't shoot what it can't feed. And it can't feed what it can't pay. And somewhere behind every soldier who got home to his kids there was a tired person like me, making sure the dollars landed where they were supposed to. I made my peace with being invisible a long time ago. The Army taught me that. My family taught it to me first. I grew up the second child and the only daughter in a 2-story house on a street where every porch had a flag and every flag came down in a thunderstorm. My father, Raymond Doyle, sold insurance for 31 years and believed the world was divided into people who mattered and people who were useful. My older brother, Glenn, was the one who mattered. I was the useful one. Nobody ever said that to my face. They didn't have to. You learn it the way you learn the layout of a dark room. By walking into the same corners over and over. Glenn broke a window with a baseball. Boys will be boys. I got a B+ on a chemistry exam. What happened to the other points? Glenn quit the wrestling team in October. He had a lot on his plate. I made captain of the math team, and my father asked, at dinner, in front of everyone, whether that was really how I wanted people to think of me. My mother, Eileen, wasn't cruel. She was outnumbered. She'd married into the Doyd theory of the world and spent her whole life trying to keep the peace inside it, which mostly meant looking down at her plate when my father started in on me. By the time I was 11, I'd stopped waiting for her to look up. By 13, I'd stopped wanting her to. You can only watch a person decide not to defend you so many times before you start handling your own defense and theirs too, just to save the weight. I'll give you one example, because one is worth more than a list. When I was 15, I won a regional thing in mathematics, a tournament. I'd qualified through 3 rounds, and the final was held 2 hours away in Columbus on a Saturday in February. I'd been telling them about it for a month. I'd ironed a blouse. My father had said he'd drive me, and I believed him, the way you keep believing a person right up until the exact second they teach you not to. That Saturday morning, Glenn's car wouldn't start in the driveway. He had a date that night, and the car was a non-negotiable part of the plan. And my father spent the morning under the hood of Glenn's Camaro instead of driving me to Columbus, and by the time he came in wiping his hands it was 11 o'clock, and the thing started at noon 2 hours away, and the math was simple, even for a family that I was bad at it. I didn't go. I sat at the kitchen table in the ironed blouse and listened to my father say, not unkindly, that there'd be other tournaments, and that family came first, and that I'd understand someday when I had a family of my own. Glenn made his date. I never qualified for that final again. You only get the one shot at the bracket. I'm 54 and I can still tell you the smell of that kitchen. Coffee and motor oil off my father's hands, And that's the thing about the small ones. The big betrayals you can frame and hang on the wall. It's the small ones that get into the grout. The only person in that family who ever looked straight at me was my grandfather, Colonel Walter Doyle. My father's father, which always struck me as the strangest thing, that a man like Raymond came out of a man like Walter, like a flat soda from a good spring. Walter had been a logistics officer in Korea, and then a quartermaster colonel for 2 more wars after that. He understood, the way I would come to understand, that the people who keep the trains running never get the medals and don't much care. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He had a way of going quiet and waiting, and the quiet did the work for him. When I was 12, I sat behind his garage one Sunday after my father had spent 20 minutes at lunch explaining, with the patience of a man explaining gravity, why Glenn deserved a used truck for his 16th birthday and why my asking to take an extra math class over the summer was Margaret making everything about Margaret again. I went out back so nobody would see my face do the thing it wanted to do. Walter found me. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down on the cold concrete next to me, in his good slacks, and handed me a bottle of root beer he'd been keeping in the freezer just long enough that it had gone half to slush. We sat there a while. A dog 2 yards over kept barking at nothing. "You want to know why they've got you wrong?" he finally said. I shrugged. I was 12. Shrugging was the whole vocabulary. "Because they're weighing you on a broke scale," he said. "And a broke scale always reads light. Doesn't mean the thing on it weighs nothing. Means you need a better scale." He took a pull of his own root beer. "Get yourself somewhere they measure right. Then it won't matter what this house thinks you weigh." I have carried that sentence for 40 years. There were nights in barracks in 3 countries when it was the only warm thing I owned. I enlisted at 18. My father laughed for the first week and was angry for the second. "You'll wash out by Christmas," he said. "You're not built for it. You're a quitter. You quit piano. You quit Girl Scouts." I hadn't quit either. He'd stopped paying for them when Glenn needed something. But there's no arguing with a man's memory of you. It's load-bearing. Take it out and the whole house of him comes down, and he knows it, so he holds on. What I remember most is Walter setting down his fork at that dinner and saying very mildly, "Funny, you said all that about me, Ray." Word for word, near enough. Your mother kept the letter. And the table going quiet, and my father's face doing something I had never seen it do, back down. First time in my life I watched him lose. I didn't gloat. I was too busy memorizing how it was done. The army measured right. That's the whole story of why I stayed. It didn't care whose daughter I was. It didn't care that Glenn got the truck. It cared whether the numbers closed, and mine closed, every time. And somebody noticed. And this noticing came with a rank, and the rank came with more numbers to close. For the first time effort and result were connected by a straight line instead of a maze that always dumped me back at my father's disappointment. I'd have re-enlisted for that feeling alone. Never mind the pension. Over the years, I learned a specific trade inside the trade. Forensic accounting, the version of my job where the numbers had been made to lie on purpose, by someone with a reason, and my job was to find the seam. Contract fraud. Phantom vendors. A supply sergeant who'd invented a trucking company that existed only as a P.O. box and a bank account. You learn, doing that work long enough, that money is the most honest thing in the world if you make it talk in order. People lie. Money just moves. And movement leaves a track, and a track can be walked. There's a thing they teach you early in that line of work, and it stuck to me harder than anything else the Army ever taught. Follow the money, not the story. Everybody comes to you with a story. The story is always clean, and the story is always about character. He's a good man, she'd never, their family. The story is designed to make you stop looking. The money has no such interest. The money doesn't care if the man is a deacon or your own father. It went where it went, on a date, in an amount, and if you lay the transactions end to end in the order they happened, the money will tell you a different story than the people will every single time, and the money will be the one telling the truth. I once unwound a $400,000 scheme by a man everyone in the battalion would have sworn for, including me, because the dates didn't care how much we liked him. The first casualty of looking honestly at money is usually your faith in somebody you trusted. I'd had that faith taken from me so many times as a child that by adulthood I had a high tolerance for the wound. It turned out to be a professional advantage. The things that break most people's hearts were, for me, just Tuesday. Glenn, meanwhile, was matters of a different kind. He sold cars. Then he sold boats. Then he sold a multi-level vitamin thing. Then he opened a restaurant that lasted a summer. Then he was between things for a stretch of years that somehow never seemed to lower his truck payment. Every time he fell, my father caught him. Money mostly. And when my father ran short, the catching fell to Walter, quietly, the way Walter did everything. I didn't know how much. That's the thing I want you to hold on to. Because it matters later. I genuinely did not know the size of it. I'd send Walter a card on his birthday from whatever base I was on and call him every Sunday at 7 his time, and we'd talk about the Reds' bullpen and whether the deer had been at his tomatoes. And not once in 26 years did that man complain to me about what he was carrying. People are comfortable letting you carry weight as long as you never set it down where they can see it. My mother passed when I was 41. A fast cancer 11 weeks start to finish, and I got compassionate leave for the last 2 of them and sat in a hospital room in Columbus holding the hand of a woman who'd spent her life not looking up, and at the very end she looked up. "You were the strong one," she said. "I'm sorry I let that mean you didn't need anything." I've turned that sentence over 1,000 times. I still don't know if it was an apology or just an explanation. Maybe at the end those are the same thing. After she died, the family came apart along the seams it had always had. My father got harder, Glenn got hungrier, and Walter and I got closer, 2 quiet people in a loud and shrinking family, holding the line. 3 years before the courtroom, Walter had a stroke. I was stateside by then, a year from retirement, stationed close enough to drive. I got there while he could still talk, though the words came slow and arrived a little out of order, like mail after a holiday. I sat with him for 2 days. On the second day, he squeezed my hand with the side that still worked and said, "Still hauling the whole family up the hill on your back, aren't you?" "Trying to," I said. "Good," he said. "Somebody's got to be able to." And then, after a long pause where I thought he drifted off, "I fixed the scale, Maggie. Don't let them tell you it's broke." I thought he meant the kitchen scale. He was 88 and slurring, and I was tired and grieving in advance. And I thought the man was talking about a kitchen scale. I told you the truth would have to sit in a room and be looked at. I didn't even recognize it when it was holding my hand. He died 14 months later. The funeral was the last time the whole family stood in one place. Glenn spent it in the vestibule on his phone, doing what I now know was the math on a number he thought was coming to him. My father shook hands at the door like he was running for something. I stood by the casket and thought about a slush-cold root beer and a broke scale, and I did not cry where anyone could sell it. The will reading was 9 days later, in the conference room of a firm in Asheville, North Carolina, where Walter had moved after Korea cold Ohio finally wore his joints out. He'd loved those mountains. He used to say the only thing the Army ever did for his soul was station him once at a post with a view, and he'd spent his retirement chasing that view until he found it in the Blue Ridge. The lawyer was a woman about my age named Frances Okafor, careful and dry, the kind of professional who reads a room before she reads a document. She handled the small things first. A pocket watch to Glenn, a set of campaign maps framed to a veterans museum, the house in the mountains sold, proceeds split 3 ways between my father, Glenn, and me, even thirds. And I watched Glenn relax at that, watched him think the rest would run the same pattern, the pattern that had run his whole life. Then Frances came to the investment accounts. I won't pretend I understood the size of it in that moment any better than Glenn did. Walter had spent 50 years putting away a colonel's pay and then a colonel's pension, plus a piece of land outside Knoxville that the interstate had decided, decades later, to run past. Frances read the number. I heard my father stop breathing. It was more than a house. It was more than several houses. It was the kind of number that rearranges a family's idea of itself in real time, and I watched it rearrange theirs while I sat very still, because stillness was the only thing I'd ever been able to count on under fire. The residuary estate, Frances read, I leave in its entirety to my granddaughter, Margaret Doyle. She paused the way you pause at a curb. It is not divided. It is not shared. She will know why. The room did the thing rooms do. Glenn laughed first. Actually laughed, one short bark, because his brain refused the sentence on the first pass and reached for the only explanation that fit his model of the world, which was that it must be a joke. Then he saw Frances's face, and the laugh died in his throat with the ugliest little sound. That's not, my father started. He looked at me. 40 years I'd waited to see him look at me like I mattered. And now that he finally did, what was in his eyes was not love. It was accusation. "What did you do?" he said. Not a question. "What did you say to him?" I asked about his tomatoes, I said. "You manipulated an old man." His voice climbed. "You isolated him from us and you—" "Raymond," Frances said, in the tone you'd use on a dog near a road. It didn't matter. By the time we left that conference room, my father and Glenn were already on the phone with a man whose hourly rate could have fed a platoon. 3 weeks later I was served. Undue influence. Lack of capacity. Fraud. They wanted the will thrown out and the estate split the way God and Raymond Doyle intended. And here's the part where I'm supposed to tell you I was scared or furious, or that I lay awake. I didn't. I want to be honest about that because the not feeling is part of what this story is about. I felt the way I felt the first time I opened a fraud case file and saw the shape of the lie before I could prove it. A kind of cold, clean focus. They had handed me a problem, made of money, and asked me, in effect, to follow it. I'd been following money for 26 years. They just never bothered to learn that about me, because learning it would have meant looking. I told Frances I'd be representing myself. She took her glasses off. "Maggie, I have to advise against that strongly. You have the means to hire—" "I know my rights here," I said. "Every American does. It's called pro se. The person challenging a valid will carries the burden of proof, not the beneficiary. They have to prove Walter was manipulated or incompetent. I don't have to prove I'm a saint. I just have to make sure the truth gets in the room. And I read documents for a living, Frances. This whole thing is documents." She studied me for a long moment the way Walter used to. "You sound like him," she said finally. "He told me you would. I didn't ask what else told her. I should have. But I was already walking the money in my head. When my father heard I'd be going in without a lawyer, he laughed. When Glenn heard, he laughed harder, and called me 3 times that week to make sure I understood what a mistake I was making. Each call a little more generous in its concern, the way Glenn got generous only when he smelled an advantage. "I just don't want you embarrassed, Mags," he said. "Get a lawyer. Or just settle. Take the third you'd have gotten and we're square." "We've never been square a day in our lives," I said, and hung up. And that was the last civil sentence I'd say to my brother for a long time. The morning the hearing started, I got to the courthouse 20 minutes early. Old habit. In the Army, on time is late, and late is somebody not getting paid. I sat in my car in the lot and looked at myself in the rearview, the way I had before every hard thing for 26 years, and I gave myself the only briefing that ever mattered. The other side will look confident. Confidence isn't evidence. Walk the money. Let the room watch you be calm. Calm is a language older people read fluently, because they've seen enough panic to know what its opposite is worth. Inside, Glenn was already there in a suit that cost more than the truth would, standing next to a tall man with silver hair, and the easy posture of someone who bills in 15-minute increments. Their attorney. Del Pruitt, one of the better-known probate litigators in the western part of the state. The kind whose billboard you've seen, even if you've never needed him. My father stood a little apart, smaller than I remembered, the suit hanging off him. Grief or fear or both. Hard to tell from across a lobby. Glenn saw me and grinned. "You actually showed up, without a lawyer." And a few people laughed, and Pruitt clicked his pen, and we went in. I'm going to tell you what the inside of that fight actually looked like. Because the part everybody wants. The part where the judge says the thing in a man's whole life caves in. Doesn't land unless you understand the patient, unglamorous work that earned it. The truth doesn't detonate. It accumulates. That's the lesson I'd put above the door of every courtroom in this country if they let me. The judge was a man named Harlan Boyd. 60s. Former JAG himself, it turned out, which I didn't know going in, and which would matter. He had the stillness of a man who had been lied to professionally for 30 years, and had stopped being entertained by it. He read the will. He read the petition. He looked over the top of his glasses at the empty chair beside me, then at the wall of paper beside Glenn, and he didn't say anything about either, which told me he was fair. A man who'd already decided would have let his face show it. Pruitt ran the first day, and he ran it well. I'll give him that. He didn't try to prove Walter was senile. That's a hard mountain, and he was too smart to climb it. He went the easier route, the one that wins these cases far more often than people think. He built a picture. Drip by drip, the lonely old man in the mountains, far from his son and his grandson back in Ohio, and the one family member who'd gotten close in the last years. Close enough to call every week. Close enough to know about the tomatoes. Close enough, the picture suggested without ever saying it, to whisper in an old man's ear about who deserved what. He called a neighbor first. A kind, nervous woman named Doris Pelletier, who'd lived 2 doors down from Walter for a decade, and clearly didn't want to be there. Did Margaret visit often? Pruitt asked. She called, mostly. She was overseas a lot. But yes, when she could. More than the others. Well, yes. Raymond and Glenn, I don't think I ever saw them, honestly. And in those last couple of years, did Mr. Doyle ever mention changing his will? Doris hesitated. He said once he'd gotten his affairs in order. After Maggie came through one Christmas. Pruitt let that sit. He was good at letting things sit. He'd lay a stone and step back, and let the room build the wall on its own. During a recess that first morning, Glenn made a point of finding me at the water fountain. He had a paper cup in his hand, and a thing he wanted to say, and he said it low, the way he'd learned somewhere, that menace travels better quiet. You know what your problem always was, Mags? You think being right is the same as winning. Dad's got the better lawyer, the better story, and 3 witnesses. You've got a folder and a chip on your shoulder the size of a tank. He crushed the cup. Take the settlement. I'm trying to do you a favor here. He'd been doing me favors my whole life, my brother, every one of them shaped exactly like a knife-handed grip first. I drank my water and went back in. The second witness was that cousin of my father's, Dale, who'd driven down from Ohio in a suit that still had the store crease in the sleeve. He testified that Walter wasn't himself near the end, that he'd seemed confused, that he relied on Maggie for just about everything. Then Pruitt put up a photograph. Walter at a family reunion years back, my whole grinning family arranged on a porch, and me cropped to the very edge of the frame, half out of it, because that's where I'd stood for the photo and that's where I'd stood for the family. Pruitt didn't say anything about the crop, he didn't need to. The picture made his argument for him. Here is the family, and here, at the margin, barely in it, is the woman who somehow ended up with everything. It was a good move. It was the same move my whole childhood had made on me, and I'd be lying if I said the old reflex didn't twitch, the urge to apologize for the space I took up. By the end of the first day, my father looked satisfied, and Glenn looked downright merry, leaning back in his chair like a man at a game his team was winning. And I had asked almost no questions and objected to nothing, and I could feel the room reading my silence as defeat. Let them. Silence has a way of making people fill it, and people fill it with the truth about themselves. During the lunch recess, I found a bench by a tall window at the end of the hall, and I was eating an apple and rereading the petition's exhibit list when a shadow fell across the page. Judge Boyd. Not on the bench, just a man in a hallway holding a cup of coffee. I started to stand. Sit, sit, he said. He looked out the window for a second. Can I ask you something off the record, Major? I saw the DD 214 in your filing. Finance Corps. 26 years, Your Honor. My brother was finance. He used to say the most dangerous person in any unit was the one who knew where all the money slept. He almost smiled. Why no lawyer? I'd thought about how to answer that, and the true answer turned out to be the simplest one. Because a lawyer would make this about the law, I said. And it isn't, really. It's about the fact that my father and brother have spent 50 years certain they know exactly who I am and exactly what I'm worth. A lawyer standing between us lets them keep that. I don't want to win the case as much as I want them to have to sit in a room and look at the actual numbers. The numbers don't care whose daughter I am. I learned that a long time ago. I'd like them to learn it too. He was quiet a moment. Then he glanced down at the thick folder under his arm. Not the will. The other one, my filing, the exhibits, and something moved across his face. He'd read ahead. I could see it. He'd read ahead and seen where the money went. And he was a finance brother's brother, and a former JAG. And he knew how to read a track when one was laid in front of him. Courtrooms, he said, putting his glasses back on, have a way of showing people the thing they worked hardest not to see. He started to walk off, then stopped, including, sometimes, the people who file the petition. And he went back to chambers, and I sat there with my apple going brown in my hand, and for the first time I let myself feel something, and what I felt was not triumph. It was closer to dread. Because I knew by then what was in that folder, and I knew it was going to take the last living thing my father had, not his money, His story about himself. And I was the one who was going to do it. The second morning, Boyd came in carrying 2 folders instead of 1. Pruitt noticed. I watched his shoulders set. He opened with emotion. 15 minutes of careful argument. All of it circling the same drain. Margaret had access. Margaret had opportunity. Margaret had motive. And Walter had been an old man alone in the mountains. He was building the legal frame for undue influence, and he was building it competently, and when he finished, he looked satisfied in a way I recognized. The satisfaction of a man who has stopped checking whether he's right because he's so sure. Boyd turned to me. Ms. Doyle, response? I stood. No notes. You don't read notes to a room you want to keep, you look at them. Your Honor, the burden here belongs to the petitioners. They've spent a day telling you I was close to my grandfather. I was. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I loved him, and he loved me, and we talked every Sunday for 20 years. But closeness isn't coercion. The law requires them to show that I substituted my will for his. So I'd like to do something simple. I'd like to walk the court through the timeline they've built, and then I'd like to show the court where each of their witnesses actually was, and where I actually was, on the dates that matter. Because this case isn't about feelings. It's about a calendar and a checkbook, and both of those keep records. Boyd nodded slowly. Proceed. I started with Doris Pelletier's after Maggie came through one Christmas. I asked Francis, who I'd subpoenaed as a hostile to no one witness, just a record custodian, to confirm the date Walter executed the will. Then I put up my own travel records. On the Christmas Doris half remembered, I had been in Kuwait. I had the orders. I had the flight manifest. I had a photo, time-stamped, of me in a chow hall in a Santa hat someone had made me wear, 8,000 miles from a mountain in North Carolina. Walter had revised that will in March, alone, with Francis, 3 months after a Christmas I had spent on another continent. It wasn't dramatic. That's the point. It was a date next to a date, but you could feel the wall. Pruitt had spent a day building, lose its first stone, because the room could see, all at once, that the pictures had been assembled out of vibes and the documents disagreed. I did it again with their cousin Dale, who I called back for cross. I asked Dale how many times he'd visited Walter in that last year. He said several. I asked Francis to produce the assisted living facility's visitor log. Every name, every date, every sign-in and sign-out, kept for liability the way that whole industry keeps everything. Dale had visited twice. Both visits under 20 minutes. He'd built wasn't himself, out of 2 short visits and a feeling, and when I laid the log in front of him he got quiet and then he got honest. The way people do when the paper is right there, and lying to it feels too stupid to attempt. I guess, assumed, he said. The word hung there. Assumed. Half their case was assumptions wearing the costume of memory. By the second afternoon the temperature in the room had reversed. Pruitt was no longer laying stones and stepping back. He was reaching out to catch ones that were falling. And then I did the thing I'd been saving. The thing that turned the case from a defense into something else. I asked the court's permission to introduce evidence on capacity, since the petitioners had put Walter's mind at issue. Boyd allowed it. And I played the facility's security footage. Months of it condensed. Walter at the front desk asking why his statement showed a fee he didn't recognize, and being right. Walter playing bridge, and counting cards out loud to needle his partner. Walter signing for a package and checking the delivery against the invoice, by hand, because once a quartermaster, always a quartermaster. 20 minutes of a sharp old man being sharp. The petitioners had told the court he was a husk that I'd hollowed out and filled with my own wishes. The tape showed a man who'd have caught me trying in about 4 seconds and never spoken to me again. When it ended, I said, "The petitioners raised his capacity, Your Honor. I'll rest on the tape." And I sat down. That should have been the end of it. A normal person, a person who only wanted to keep what was hers, would have stopped there. The will was safe. I could see it on Boyd's face. The case was effectively over. But I hadn't filed everything yet. There was a last exhibit, and it had never been about the inheritance. Here is where I have to slow down and tell you the thing I'd found, because if I just spring it on you the way I sprung it on that room, it'll feel like one of those stories where the hero pulls a rabbit out of a hat. This wasn't a rabbit. This was the seam I'd seen at the will reading and spent 6 weeks of discovery walking, dollar by dollar, the only skill I ever truly had. At the will reading, Francis had read the value of the estate, and a small wrong note had sounded in my head. The kind of note I'd trained 26 years to hear. The number was big, but it was smaller than it should have been. I knew roughly what a colonel's lifetime of careful saving looked like, and I knew about the Knoxville land, and the total Francis read was light. Not by a little, by a lot. At the time, grief-blind, I'd let it go. When the lawsuit came, I stopped letting it go. I requested Walter's financial records in discovery, which I had every right to, since the petitioners had put the estate's value and Walter's competence directly at issue. And I walked the money backward, the way I'd walked 100 frauds backward, in order, patiently, asking each transaction where it had come from and where it went. It took 6 weeks. I want to say that plainly, because the way these stories usually get told, the hero finds the smoking gun in an afternoon. And that's a lie that does real harm. It makes people think that if the answer didn't come fast, there wasn't one. There's no such thing as a fast answer in money. I built a spreadsheet the way I'd built 100 of them, 1 row per transaction, 8 years deep, and then I sorted it the way the family never could. Not by who and not by why, just by when and how much. I tied each statement to the next so no dollar could appear or vanish without a partner. I flagged every round number, because honest payments are usually ugly numbers. A real invoice is $4,007.83, while a number somebody made up to look legitimate is almost always too clean. And slowly the shape came up out of the noise, the way a road comes up out of fog, not all at once, just a little more of it with every mile. What I found was this. Over the last 8 years of his life, a steady river of money had flowed out of Walter's accounts. Not to me. I want to be very clear about that. Because the petitioners had spent 2 days implying I'd drained him. I hadn't taken a dollar. I'd checked the way you check your own work first. The money went to Glenn. Loan after loan after loan. A failed restaurant. A boat. A vitamin company. Tens of thousands at a time. Then hundreds of thousands across the years. And almost none of it repaid. Walter had been quietly keeping my brother afloat for the better part of a decade, the same way he'd kept my father afloat before that. The thing he carried and never set down where I could see it. It was Glenn. It was always Glenn. But that wasn't the seam. That was just sad. The seam was this. In the 11 months before Walter's stroke, the pattern changed. The money stopped flowing to Glenn as loans. It started moving to Glenn as transfers, gifts, on paper, and it moved through an account my father controlled. Power of attorney. My father had gotten Walter to sign a financial power of attorney during a hospital stay for pneumonia, and in the months after, more than $200,000 had moved out of Walter's accounts under that authority, to my father, and from my father onward to Glenn and to 2 accounts I couldn't fully trace. That money never appeared in the estate inventory. It had been moved out before Walter died, so it wasn't in the estate to be counted. Which is exactly why the number Francis read had sounded light to me. The estate I was being accused of stealing had already been quietly emptied by the 2 men accusing me, using an old man's power of attorney, in the last year of his life. That is elder financial abuse. It has a name, and it has a definition, and it happens, in this country, to something like 1 in 10 older Americans, most often at the hands of the family member they trust most, and it almost never gets seen, because the victim is gone or ashamed or both, and because the people who do it are exactly the people the rest of the family would never suspect. I had a name for it because I'd spent my career on its uglier military cousin. My father and brother had a name for it too. They called it taking care of their own. So when Boyd was reaching for his gavel to end the thing, I stood back up. Your Honor, I have one more exhibit. It doesn't go to the validity of the will. It goes to something the petitioners raised themselves when they put the estate's value in question. I handed the packets to the clerk, to Pruitt, to the bench. It's a reconstruction of the transfers out of my grandfather's accounts under a financial power of attorney executed during a hospital admission 11 months before his death. Pruitt read the first page and went still in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. He hadn't known. I'd suspected he didn't. A lawyer who knew this was in the file would never have built a case that invited me to open it. His clients had hired a good man and told him a clean story and sent him into a room with a forensic accountant holding their bank records. I almost felt for him. Boyd read it slower than he'd read anything. I watched his jaw set. Former JAG, I remembered. He'd prosecuted men for less. Mr. Pruitt, he said without looking up, were you aware of these transfers? Pruitt stood. To his credit, he didn't lie. I was not, Your Honor. Boyd turned the page. Mr. Doyle, my father. Did you, holding power of attorney for your father, transfer funds from his accounts to yourself and to your son in the year before his death? The room was so quiet I could hear the building. My father opened his mouth. For 40 years that mouth had had an answer for everything, mostly an answer about me. Nothing came out. He looked at the packet, and then he looked at me, and the look had changed again. It wasn't accusation anymore. It was the face of a man watching a flood reach the second floor of a house he was sure he'd built on a hill. Glenn got there a half-second behind. I watched it land on him, that his father had moved money through accounts Glenn didn't fully control, that some of it had gone places even Glenn couldn't see, that the man who'd caught him his whole life had been doing his own quiet math the whole time. Glenn turned to my father with a face I'd never seen him make, because I'd never once seen Glenn on the wrong side of Raymond Doyle's protection. "Dad," he said. "Dad, what is this? Where did the rest of it go?" My father said nothing. The silence answered for him, the way it had answered for my mother at every dinner of my childhood. I'd grown up in that silence. I knew its dialect. It was the sound of a man choosing himself and letting everyone else figure out the cost. Boyd set the packet down with the particular flatness of a man putting away a tool. "I'm denying the petition in its entirety," he said. "The will of Walter Doyle stands. Costs to the petitioners." He let that breathe. "And I'm directing the clerk to forward these financial records to the state attorney's office and to Adult Protective Services for review, along with the power of attorney instrument and the estate inventory as filed. Ms. Doyle, you'll want to speak to a probate attorney about a separate action to recover the transferred assets to the estate. I think you know that already." "I do, Your Honor." "I imagine you do." He looked at me over the glasses, and there was something in it I'd waited a lifetime to get from a man of my father's generation. And it wasn't pride, exactly. It was respect, which is better, because you can't fake your way into it and you can't inherit it. Courts adjourned. The fallout came the way fallout actually comes, which is to say slowly and through the mail. Not a thunderclap. A series of envelopes. 3 weeks after the hearing, a recovery action I filed through Francis put the power of attorney transfers in front of a different judge, and this time there was no story to tell, only the same packet, and my father's new lawyer. He fired Pruitt, of course, the way a man blames the messenger for the message, argued that the gifts had been Walter's wishes. But you can't gift money. On behalf of someone whose own bank statements show him asking the front desk about a charge he didn't recognize. The competence I'd proven to save the will turned around and proved the transfers were theft. The estate got most of it back. Not all. A chunk had gone through Glenn and out the far side into the kind of accounts that don't give money back, and that money is simply gone, the way money is gone when it passes through a man who treats it as weather. The referral to Adult Protective Services and the state attorney's office moved on its own clock, the slow grinding clock of agencies, and I won't pretend I know how it ends. Because, as of this telling, it hasn't. These things rarely end with handcuffs. They end with a settlement, a consent order. A man my father's age agreeing to repay a sum over years he may not have, and a file that closes quietly because the victim is dead and the surviving family is the perpetrator, and there's no one left to press. That's the part nobody tells you about elder financial abuse. The system is built to protect the living, and by the time the proof is solid, the person who needed protecting is a name in a will. Glenn lost more than money. He lost the thing he'd never known he was standing on, which was the certainty that whatever he broke, his father would pay for. When the recovery judgment landed, my father didn't have it to give. Most of it had gone to Glenn in the first place, and Glenn had already spent it being Glenn. For the first time. In 50 years the two of them were on the same side of a debt instead of passing it back and forth, and I'm told it did not make them closer. I'm told there was a Thanksgiving. The first one after, where it came apart at the table, the two of them finally turning the knives they'd always pointed at me on each other. I wasn't there. I heard about it from Dale, of all people, who called to apologize, the only one who ever did, and who couldn't help reporting the carnage in the same breath, because some habits outlive their reasons. And that was the moment the whole thing was supposed to give me what I'd come for. The win. The vindication. Glenn ruined, my father exposed, the will safe, the colonel's faith in me proven in open court. This is the part of the story where, if I were the kind of person they thought I was, I'd have turned to my father and said something that fit on a billboard. I didn't have anything. I sat there while the room emptied and the papers got gathered, and life resumed its ordinary noise. And I felt the thing I want to be honest about, because it's the whole reason I'm telling you any of this. I'd imagined this moment for the better part of a year. I'd imagined it would feel like setting down a rucksack at the end of a forced march. It didn't. It felt like the rucksack had never been full of what I thought. I'd carried it 40 years thinking it held their approval, and I just dumped it out on a courtroom floor in front of everybody. And there was nothing in it. There'd never been anything in it. The weight had been the carrying. My father found me in the hallway. Glenn was already gone, out to the parking lot on the phone. The family posture, doing the math on a number that was now a minus. It was just the two of us by the tall window where I'd talked to the judge the day before. He looked old, not old like a man near the end. Old like a building they've stopped heating. "You were always going to do this," he said. "Weren't you? The minute the old man left it to you. You were just waiting." I'd expected a lot of versions of him in that hallway. I hadn't expected this one. He'd been handed the clearest mirror of his life, and he'd turned it around to point at me. Even now. Even with his name in a packet headed to the Attorney General's office. The mirror was the one thing he would not look into, and I understood standing there that he never would. Some men don't deny things to get away with them. They deny them because the alternative is becoming a stranger to themselves. And at 76, that's a country they're not willing to emigrate to. "I didn't take anything from him," I said. "I want you to understand that, because I think it's the one thing you actually can't make yourself believe. I never took a dime from Grandpa. You did, and then you came after me for it. He chose you over your own family." "He chose me," I said, "because I was the only one who ever called him about something other than money. I waited. I don't know what I was waiting for. The thing my mother said at the end, maybe. I was wrong. 3 words. I'd have taken them 40 years late. I'd have taken them in a courthouse hallway with the heat off." "You always thought you were smarter than this family," he said instead. "No," I said. "I thought I was outside it. There's a difference. Smarter would have meant I wanted in and found a way. Outside is just where you put me, and I stopped trying to climb back in around the time I stopped expecting Mom to look up from her plate." Something crossed his face at the mention of her. For a second, I thought it might be the thing. The crack. He'd loved her, in his managing way, and her name in my mouth had reached something. But my father had spent 76 years learning that the way to survive a true thing was to convert it into a grievance before it could land. And I watched him do it now, watched the softness go to flint. "Your mother would be ashamed of you," he said, "dragging the family through a courtroom, putting my name in front of the state. She told me at the end that she was sorry she let being the strong one mean I didn't need anything," I said. Those were almost her last words to me. So I think we read her differently. I think we always did. But my father's whole self was built on the foundation that he was never wrong about me. And you can't pull the foundation out from under a man and expect him to thank you for the renovation. "You think you won something today," he said. His voice was almost gentle, which was worse. "You didn't. You just made sure you'll spend Christmas alone." "I've spent 26 of them in other countries," I said. "I'll manage." He looked at me a second longer. Then he buttoned his against a cold that wasn't in the building, and he walked out to find his son in the parking lot, the two of them together the way they'd always been. And I let them go. That's it. That's the ending you don't usually get. He never said it. Not that day, not since. There was no collapse, no hand to the chest, no deathbed scene where the old man finally sees clearly. He went home and hired a different lawyer to fight the recovery action, and lost, and the estate got most of the money back, and some of it had simply evaporated through Glenn, and was never found. My father and brother are, as far as I know, still telling the version of this story where I'm the villain who turned a confused old man against his own blood. I expect they'll tell it at my funeral if they outlive me. People will defend a comfortable lie longer than they'll defend their own children. I learned that at a kitchen table in Ohio before I learned long division. So why am I telling you this, if it doesn't end with the apology? Because I spent 40 years believing the apology was the prize. That if I just achieved enough, sacrificed enough, closed enough numbers, my father would one day look at me and say the words, and the whole long ache would resolve like a chord. And the thing I want to hand you, the only thing I've got worth handing across, is this: the people who refuse to see your worth cannot give you your worth. It isn't theirs to give. They're holding a broke scale. My grandfather told me that when I was 12, behind a garage, with a root beer going to slush, and it took me 42 years in a courtroom to finally believe him. He fixed the scale. That's what he meant, slurring in that hospital bed. Not the kitchen scale, the other one. The one my whole family had used to weigh me light my entire life. He couldn't make them read it right. Nobody could. I know that now. So he did the only thing a quartermaster can do when the equipment's broken beyond repair. He took it out of their hands. He put the proof of my worth somewhere they couldn't argue with it, in the cold language of a will, and he made them sit in a room and look at it. I drove up to his mountain that evening. The house was sold, but you can still park on the road below it. And I did. And I sat on the hood the way I used to sit on the cold concrete behind his garage, and I watched the light go orange and then purple over the ridge he'd chased his whole retirement to find. My knee told me weather was coming. It was right. It rained before I got back to the hotel. I didn't cry. And then I did. A little, the useful kind that doesn't ask anything of anybody. A note before you go. The legal mechanisms in this story are real, and they touch a lot more families than people realize. Undue influence, financial power of attorney, the duty to inventory an estate honestly, the right to represent yourself in a civil matter. These aren't dramatic inventions, they're the ordinary machinery of how families hand things down, and how, sometimes, they take things they shouldn't. Laws differ from state to state, and what held up in a North Carolina probate court might be structured very differently where you live. If anything here made you think about your own parents, or your own grandparents, please don't act on what you heard in a story. Sit down with a licensed elder law or estate attorney in the state where the person you're worried about actually lives. And if you suspect an older person in this life is being pressured or quietly drained by anyone, including family, the National Council on Aging runs a confidential helpline at 1-800-677-100-SUCCESS, and you can find a vetted attorney through the American Bar Association's directory. I'm not a lawyer, and nothing in what I've told you is legal advice. I'm just someone who spent a career learning that money keeps better records than people do, and that the quietest person in the family is very often the one carrying it. Walter Doyle taught me to read a scale. Go find out what your people actually weigh.